Hi, this is Chris Gordon, and this is another episode of my new show that I don't have a name for yet. Today, I want to talk about one of my favorite poems. It's called There Was a Man of Double Deed, and I'll go ahead and recite it to start off and then try to get into what I think the poem's about over the next 10 minutes or so. So, here's the poem called There Was a Man of Double Deed. There was a man of double deed who sowed his garden full of seed. When that seed began to grow, 'twas like a field of fallen snow. When that snow began to melt, 'twas like a ship without a belt. When that ship began to sail, 'twas like a bird without a tail. When that bird began to fly, 'twas like an eagle in the sky. When the sky began to roar, 'twas like a lion at my door. When my door began to crack, 'twas like a stick across my back. When my back began to smart, 'twas like a penknife in my heart. And when my heart began to bleed, 'twas death and death and death indeed. And that's it. The poem was written back in the late 1700s by no one knows. It's anonymous. The first time I heard it when I was a kid, I thought it was some sort of, someone in a Victorian era insane asylum, and somewhere in the darkest halls in the back had come up with it. It was just so crazy, so just schizophrenic and wild and weird. I still think it is, but at the same time, the poem has a structure. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It goes from birth to life, and then ultimately to death. And there was a man of double deed. I'm not really sure what the double deed is, but I'll try to get into the poem and see if maybe we can figure it out. The opening lines, there was a man of double deed who sowed his garden full of seed. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. It's about, it's about the beginnings of life, sowing your seed, conception, and then when that seed began to grow, 'twas like a field of fallen snow. I think that's pretty self-explanatory too. It's youth. It's being a child and a young kid maybe, and you're innocent, you're pure, you're white as the driven snow. But then youth sort of melts away, and that's the next line. When that snow began to melt, 'twas like a ship without a belt. And that's probably the least understood line of this poem. 'Twas like a ship without a belt. I've been on a lot of ships, and I've never seen a belt on one. I've looked it up. There's really, even from back then, unless it was some obscure expression even back then that never found its way into print, no one seems to know exactly what that means. The most interesting theory I've come across, and the one that makes the most sense, at least to me, is that belt isn't something that's on the ship. Ship without a belt means a ship without a way to travel, and that sounds kind of confusing, but if you go back to the date of the poem, late 1700s, there were no motorized ships. Everything was dependent on, if you were on a boat, you were sailing it or rowing it. Mostly sailing if you were going to go across the ocean. And a belt might have been like the trade winds that you travel in. They're a certain width across, and if you get outside of them, the belt, you're adrift. You have no winds to guide you. You're, puttering around, going nowhere, going in circles. And I think that's what that line means. So when you move from youth to young adulthood or teenagerhood or whatever, you're adrift. You're directionless. You're like a ship without a belt. That's my take. And then the next line is, when the ship began to sail, 'twas like a bird without a tail. And I think that's almost the same kind of idea. Like you're a kid You're just learning to get by in the world. You've lost your puberty. You've lost your purity, and you're like a ship without a belt. You're aimless, directionless. And once you figure that out, once you get going, you take that next step and you try to fly. But you can't do that either. You're like a bird without a tail. You might get up in the air, probably not even that. You're just going to flop around aimlessly and pointlessly. And then the next line, when that bird began to fly, 'twas like an eagle in the sky. Now I think that is when you go from adolescence or young adulthood into being a fully realized person. An eagle in the sky. The dominant thing out there, the apex predator. You're above it all. You've reached your full potential of what you're going to be. And I think that's the midpoint of the poem, especially when you take the next line into consideration, which is, when the sky began to roar, 'twas like a lion at my door. Now, that's the downfall. You reached your peak when you're an eagle in the sky, and then the sky begins to roar, and it's like a lion at your door. Not your door, my door. It's the first point, first time in the poem that it becomes personal. It goes from there was a man to my door. And I think, I don't want to overanalyze it if I haven't done that already, but I think that's when it gets more personal. When you reach what you can be and you start to descend, that's when you become more aware of not just your life, but of what's coming next. And that brings up the next line. When the sky began to roar, 'twas like a lion at my door. When my door began to crack, 'twas like a stick across my back. I think that's old age. I think that is the pain and realization that you're not going to last forever. That's what that line means to me, and it's sort of the downward slope, the second half of the poem. And the line after that is, when my back began to smart, 'twas like a penknife in my heart. Same thing. You're old, you're going downhill, it hurts, and the penknife is the first mention of the ultimate end. Penknife in your heart, you're not going to survive that. And that brings up the last two lines. When my heart began to bleed, 'twas death and death and death indeed. Now that rounds out the poem. You start from a seed and you wind up dead. And I think that's what the poem's about. And maybe that's what the double deed is. That it's in the title. You're doing two things. You're living, but when you're alive, you're also dying. And those are the two things that are happening at once. That's the two deeds are life and the inevitable end, which is death. You can't separate one from the other. One is inevitable once you start the first. The second is inevitable once you start the first. That's my take anyway. I think there's a risk of, you take a poem that's just so crazy and so out there and so interesting, and you try to, figure it out. And sometimes you can fuck it up, and you ruin it for yourself. But this poem's so weird and so interesting that I don't think you can really do that with this one. I think it's okay to try to figure it out. Maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong, who cares? But it's interesting, it's fun, and it doesn't mess the poem up. And anyway, that's what I got out of it. Like I said, this is a new show. This is my second episode. The first one was about a surgery I just had. I'm not sure what I'm going to call this yet. Maybe bring a ficus tree in here and call it Beneath the Ficus, something like that. And if anyone's watching this, possibly a few people, if you agree or disagree with what I had to say about the poem, or if you think I left something out, or if you have any ideas of your own, put them in the comments section. I'd like to hear them. I'd like to read what you have to say. And I have so few viewers, I'm almost sure to respond. So once again, Chris Gordon with my show that doesn't have a name yet, and thanks for watching.